We've been hearing a lot since Obama got elected, especially in the 2010 election and since then, that Republicans are the party of smaller government. The same thing we've heard for decades. I really have one response to this. Since when? When have Republicans ever been for smaller government? What I would like to do is go over the history of every Republican president in this country and see if there is any merit to this idea, if Republicans can actually be shown to have worked for smaller government. The first Republican ever to be elected president was Abraham Lincoln. If Abraham Lincoln was a small government guy, then I'm a creationist. Let's leave aside all the historical controversy surrounding the Civil War. During Lincoln's presidency, the size of the federal government increased dramatically. When Lincoln first took office, the federal budget was $63.2 million. That's about $1.5 billion in today's dollars. By the time he was assassinated, that had grown to $1.29 billion. Which again, adjusting for inflation, would be about $17 billion in today's money. That's an 11-fold increase. And that wasn't all military spending. Under Lincoln, non-defense spending went from $45.8 million to $63.6 million, a 141% increase. Lincoln instituted a national bank, the first one since Andrew Jackson had dismantled the second bank in the United States. He instituted an income tax, an inflationary fiat currency. Even worse than that, he was an avid supporter of protectionist tariffs and used them not only to raise revenue, but to favor politically connected industries and businesses over others. Corporatism at its finest. And when you look at federal civilian employees that had nothing to do with fighting the war, Lincoln's administration went from 26,300 civilians on the federal payroll to 53,000. But that's just one president. What about his Republican successors? Over the next 4 Republican administrations, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, and Arthur, government non-defense spending went from $96.6 million to $114.1 million, or nearly $2 billion in today's money, and during this time, the protectionist tariffs continued with a vengeance. None of the other Republican presidents helped that either. In fact, the only president who could be said to have worked for smaller government during this time was Grover Cleveland, the only Democratic president until Woodrow Wilson. Cleveland fought against high tariffs, big budgets, inflation, and imperialism. He was a big supporter of businesses in the gold standard and vetoed a bailout of Texas farmers, fighting the Republicans the whole way, including his successors, Benjamin Harrison and William McKinley, who were just as big government as their Republican colleagues. Well, maybe the Republicans start seeing the light in the 20th century. But if they did, it was certainly after Theodore Roosevelt, who oversaw perhaps the biggest expansion of government regulation and intrusion into the private market up to that time. And it wasn't William Howard Taft either. He increased government spending from $763 million to almost $1 billion. It could be said that things were better under Warren G. Harding. His response to the economic depression he inherited was hands-off, which resulted in a quick recovery. For that reason, he's hailed as a small government president. Probably the last one. But really, when you look at what happened, it was because the Depression was over before his cabinet could decide what to do. But they were considering all sorts of New Deal-esque programs to try to fix it. And when you look at everything else he did, you find that he worked for higher emergency tariffs, more restrictions on immigration, regulation on cable and radio communications, railroad and agricultural subsidies, and even welfare. However, he did decrease the size of the federal government, and not just military spending, and he decreased the deficit as well. So maybe we can meet the Republicans halfway on Harding. Still, that's only one president so far. Well, half. Calvin Coolidge is also hailed by conservatives as a small government guy. But he was still big government in many important ways. He continued Harding's policy of immigration restriction and also interfered in strike talks between businesses and labor unions. He increased regulation of radio and started government interference in the airline industry. And while he did decrease the personal income tax, literally at the same time, he increased the estate tax and created a new gift tax. It is true that he kept spending more or less flat and decreased the debt, but a lot of that can be credited to the fact that he presided over a period of economic prosperity, although in fact it later turned out to be a bubble that will lead to the 1929 stock market crash. If we look at his record as governor of Massachusetts to try and support this idea, we fail. Not only did he preside over massive growth in the Massachusetts government, he instituted intrusion after intrusion into the economy. But hey, I'm feeling generous, so let's meet the Republicans halfway again. So 2 halfway small government presidents, I guess, equals 1 proper small government president. 1 out of 11 so far. Not a very good score. It doesn't get any better with Hoover. Basically, anyone who says that Hoover had it right and FDR had it wrong with the New Deal, or that FDR succeeded where Hoover failed, is just wrong. The two presidents had almost identical policies when it came to the economy and dealing with the Great Depression. There is virtually no difference between the programs in FDR's New Deal and the programs Hoover attempted to instate, and since I think we can all agree that FDR was a big government guy, there's no way that Hoover isn't as well. He grew federal spending by 167% and the national debt by 133%. This brings us to Eisenhower. Like Coolidge, he's credited as a small government guy, but again, it's only because he happened to preside over a period of economic prosperity, arguably the only period of genuine prosperity in the 20th century, one that wasn't just a financial bubble. He rolled back government only in the sense that the Great Depression and World War II were finally over, but he expanded the government in almost every other way. He instituted the interstate highway system, greatly expanded economic aid to foreign countries, and laid the groundwork for the Vietnam War, police action. He also used the CIA to instigate coups and assassinations in foreign countries, the most significant one being the overthrowing of democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran and putting the Shah back in power, who ended up being a murderous tyrant. Pretty much all of our Iran problems since then can be traced back to this one decision. I really don't see any proper justification for considering Eisenhower a small government president, but hey, I'm really feeling generous, so let's meet them halfway on this one too. Now the score is 1.5 out of 13. Gee, do you think we might make it all the way up to 2? The next Republican president was Richard Nixon. This guy was small government like Ray Comfort is an atheist. Some people credit him with ending the Vietnam War, but his policy was actually to escalate it, and he only sought a resolution after massive public outcry. He abolished the gold standard, instituted wage and price controls, advocated the Clean Air Act and the creation of the EPA, and advocated the hideously destructive Title IX. He also signed into law the HMO Act, increasing government intrusion into healthcare and making it even more expensive and inaccessible. Additionally, he entrenched us in the conflict between Israel and the OPEC countries, which led directly to the 1970s energy crisis. What's more, he got the ball rolling on the insane war on drugs. Even without going into the famous Watergate scandal, this guy was big government through and through. You could argue that Ford was better, but then he'd have to be, wouldn't he? Still, his economic policy was based on the hideously wrong notion of the Keynesians that fixing inflation would automatically fix unemployment, and in the attempt, he made both of them worse. In a move that will cause many of us to experience deja vu, he reacted to a swine flu epidemic in which a strain of H1N1 resulted in 1 death, and instituted a massive vaccination campaign, causing the vaccine to be hurried through without proper safety testing. As a result, the vaccine ended up killing more people than the flu did. In addition to all that, his administration ran a deficit every single year, which didn't at all stop him from instigating new programs, including subsidies to schools for handicapped children and the Human Rights Watch. He got us even more deeply embroiled in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and although he concluded Nixon's policy of ending the Vietnam War, he continued to send aid to South Vietnam and spent almost $500 million to help Vietnamese refugees settle in the U.S., all things that the federal government has no constitutional authority to do. So now we come to the Republican president most often hailed by conservatives as a paragon of smaller government, Ronald Reagan. Are we going to be able to increase the score, which is now 1.5 out of 15, all the way up to 2, or even 2.5? Don't hold your breath! About the only thing you could say about Reagan that was small government was that he cut taxes. But since he didn't cut spending, in fact he dramatically increased both military and domestic spending, the only result from that was increased deficits. And he didn't really cut taxes that much either, just a small cut over 3 years. But he also signed into law what was at the time the largest tax increase in American history, in only his second year in office. Under Reagan, total spending increased 157% and the deficit increased by 261%, despite his promise to balance the budget. Reagan expanded the military by 171%, but he also expanded the very domestic programs he promised to cut, so much so that domestic spending rose 152%. Now, the excuse the conservatives give here was that there was a Democratic Congress, and they were the ones doing all the spending. But it's still the case that every single budget Reagan submitted to Congress was larger than the one Congress had passed the year before, and there was only one budget bill that Congress passed over Reagan's veto. So where's this smaller government? It certainly isn't in the hideous and insane war on drugs, which Reagan reasserted after Carter softened. This included such anti-freedom big government concepts such as asset forfeiture, where government agents can confiscate your property without so much as charging you with a crime, in blatant violation of the Fifth Amendment, as well as mandatory minimum sentencing, resulting in long sentences of 20 years or more, even life without parole, for nonviolent drug offenses, while murderers are set free in less than 10 years. His other small government promises were empty. For example, he promised to end draft registration. He didn't even so much as ask Congress to consider it. Of course, the conservatives cheer that Reagan ended the Cold War by outspending the Soviets. Oh, really? The Soviet Union fell because they couldn't keep up with the US? How does that make sense? Switzerland couldn't keep up either. Neither could the UK or China or New Zealand or Luxembourg. So why didn't those nations collapse? Their military spending wasn't anywhere near what the US was. The rest of his foreign policy wasn't all that great either. He supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, calling them freedom fighters. Today they're called terrorists. He committed disastrous invasions in Libya, Lebanon, and Grenada. He supported brutal tyrannical dictators in many countries and rebel factions in others. It was sheer insanity. Neither was there any sort of capitalist revival during Reagan's administration. Real median family income only went up 1.4% per year during the Reagan years, whereas the average of all years, good and bad, from 1947 to 1970 was 2.8%. No, you don't get an increase in the score for Reagan. I can't even meet you halfway. The score is now 1.5 out of 16. And do I really need to go into the bushes? Just for the sake of giving the numbers, George H.W. Bush increased spending by 121% and the deficit by 190%, and George W. Bush increased spending by 160% and deficit spending by 170%. When we look at the track record of Republican presidents, we find that, even in our most generous mood, the best score they can get for their devotion to small government is 1.5 out of 18, a measly 8.3%. Why would anyone in their right mind believe Republicans when they say they're for small government, when they've participated in growing this bloated, debt-ridden bureaucracy just as much as Democrats have? The last president we had that was in any real measure devoted to small constitutional government was Grover Cleveland, and he was a Democrat. Okay, you have the exceptions: Ron Paul, Barry Goldwater, Robert Taft, but they're the exceptions, overshadowed by political blowhards who love paying lip service to small government, but end up just being more big government politicians. As Harry Brown said, Republicans campaign like libertarians, but rule like Democrats. What's it gonna take until you aren't fooled anymore?